So I will start with presenting a book chapter, and then we'll call out the following speakers. So in this book chapter, my co-authors Laila, who is also here in this room today, and Metodi Sotirov, also from the University of Freiburg, together with our co-authors Matthias Kram and Sven Wunder, both from the European Forest Institute, we analyzed the emergence of a new governance regime for forest and ecosystem risk commodities. So in this book chapter, we asked the key research question about what are the designed and expected macro-level theories of change, of key policies and governance mechanisms regulating legal and or sustainable forest and ecosystem risk commodity value chains, and what their main intervention logics are and how they interact. We did that by reviewing the scientific literature and analyzing selected policies and legislative documents and grey literature. And we applied an adapted theoretical framework based on Bernstein and Cashore, the 4 pathways of influence framework, which includes the rules pathway, which refers to, for instance, legally binding hard laws or non-legally binding soft laws. The norms and discourses pathway, which, for instance, refers to normative adherence to hard or soft rules. The markets pathway of influence, which, for instance, refers to market incentives or disincentives. And then we adopted the last pathway of influence to enhance its applicability to supply-side policies and governance mechanisms, and to account for different directions of influence with an information and resources pathway of influence. So importantly, all of these pathways can have a domestic direction of influence, so either domestically on the supply side. So in our case, we're looking at Brazil, Cameroon, and Gabon as our key non-EU producer countries, or domestically on the demand side. So in our case, we're mostly looking at the European Union. And then all of these pathways can also have an external action-oriented direction of influence. So for instance, from the supply side to the demand side, or vice versa. So what we did was we mapped the emergence of a new governance regime for forest and ecosystem risk commodities and analyzed the different pathways of influence of different policies and governance mechanisms at the international level, at the transnational, and at the national level. And I will go in greater detail through this slide on the following slides. So first, on the international level, we have international laws, hard laws that are legally binding and agreed by a global range of actors, such as the Paris Agreement, which mostly relies on the rules pathway of influence. However, since the UN does not have the power of coercion, compliance also strongly relies with normative adherence to these hard rules. Then we have non-legally binding soft laws, such as UN conferences, agendas, and frameworks, such as the SDGs, and more specifically related to forest, REDD+. And all of these rather rely on non-legally binding pathways of influence. So for instance, through the norms and discourses, markets, or information and resources pathway of influence. Now, in the absence of a global forest convention, different transnational and national policies and governance mechanisms emerged to regulate the production and also supply chains of forest and agricultural commodities. So in the timber sector, this includes the so-called transnational timber legality regime, where the FLEGT initiative, so the EU Forest Law Enforcement Governance and Trade FLEGT Action Plan, is described as its experimentalist core. And this FLEGT Action Plan led to the development of 2 EU laws regulating timber legality, as defined by producer countries. So this includes the EU Timber Regulation and the EU FLEGT Regulation, mostly relying on the rules pathway of influence. However, these laws also rely on design synergies with other pathways of influence, either within the same mechanism or also other mechanisms, such as the Forest Law Enforcement Governance and Trade Voluntary Partnership Agreements. So these are voluntary partnership agreements between the EU and non-EU tropical producer countries to ensure timber legality, but also, for instance, in terms of private regulation, as for instance, certification can also support the EUTR's risk assessment and mitigation procedures. Now, this regime, the timber legality regime or the EU timber legality laws, did not regulate agricultural commodities, even though agriculture is actually the most important driver of global deforestation. And so, as most of you know, the EU developed this new law, the EU Deforestation Regulation, which repeals the EU timber regulation and also introduces some key changes to the timber legality regime by, for instance, now no longer accepting FLEGT licenses as a full green lane market advantage. So under the EU timber regulation, if a product was covered by a FLEGT license, that product could be directly imported to or exported to the European Union. And now under the EUDR, there's this new deforestation-free requirement, which is also described as a new sustainability requirement, which is defined by the EU and thus goes beyond producer country laws. So the EU timber regulation regulated timber legality as defined by producer countries, and now the EU changed this approach. Compared to the EUDR has a broader objective. So the EUDR focused on regulating timber legality. The EUDR now seeks to minimize the Union's contribution to deforestation and forest degradation, and also has some greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity loss reduction goals with the aim to then overall reduce global deforestation. Some key innovations include the expanded product scope to include a range of agricultural commodities, and as I mentioned before, this new deforestation-free standard, but also more comprehensive legality standards, or a more comprehensive legality standard, and new due diligence statement submission obligations. So overall, we can see that the EUDR relies on a stronger state-based regulatory approach compared to voluntary private regulation and the EU timber legality laws. And similar developments have also occurred outside of the EU, but with some important key differences. So after Brexit, the United Kingdom transferred or adopted the UK timber and timber products placing on the markets regulation, the UKTR, the FLEGT regulation, and FLEGT VPAs. And these are basically the same or very similar to the EUTR FLEGT regulation and EU FLEGT VPAs. And now to regulate agricultural commodities, the UK decided to regulate those in a separate legislative initiative, the new forest risk due diligence provisions in the UK Environment Act. And similarly, the US is drafting a Forest Act, and the key difference to the EU is that they maintain the approach of regulating agricultural commodity legality as defined by producer countries. So overall, we can see that this regime relies on the combination of legally binding and non-binding intervention logics, but that these dominant intervention logics also rely on design synergies with other intervention logics within the same instrument or also other instruments. And design challenges are particularly apparent in regulatory attempts to balance social, environmental, and economic goals. And in line with other scholars, we also find an increase in public regulation in regulating forest and ecosystem risk commodities. And key normative questions include who can and should regulate these value chains and how. And while it is important to close regulatory gaps, it is also important to improve the implementation of existing policies and governance mechanisms. So for instance, also in terms of the EU timber regulation, there were many challenges in implementing and enforcing the EU timber regulation inside of the EU, which also counteracted the theory of change with the FLEGT VPAs, so combining a market restrictive and market supportive approach. And with that, I'm looking forward to your questions. Thanks a lot.
I guess, okay. I know in your broader PhD, you've done so much great work understanding the political processes behind this EUDR so much. And my question to you is, so it's not just this presentation, but it's related, is to what extent did the producer countries that are being, that this regulation is being imposed on, did they have any fingerprint on this on the theories of change, or are the theories of change just completely unilaterally from the EU?
Yeah, so I would say it's pretty unilateral, and I also heard in some interviews that this was also the intent from the EU policymakers, and this is partially. Is this mic working? Yeah. Okay. This is also partially because of the difficulties with implementing the FLEGT voluntary partnership agreements, as they took a very long time. But then there's also some criticism, especially from producer countries, how the EU went about it. And for instance, Indonesia was quite upset about now this new regulation and the changes to the FLEGT VPAs. And they, for instance, raised like, why wouldn't the EU come and ask us to expand the regime they have, so the SVLK, their timber legality assurance system, to incorporate, for instance, these new sustainability requirements. So I think it's really an attempt from the European Union there were also really attempts to get rid of the FLEGT regulation, like this was also mentioned in the FLEGT impact assessment. And maybe the only footprint they had was that the EU then maintained FLEGT licenses as fulfilling the legality requirement as sort of a compromise, or how it's also framed to maintain bilateral commitments in the EUDR. Yes, thank you.
Well, maybe a follow-up question then. Do you see disagreements within governments in producing countries that might also back up or be more critical to the EUDR, meaning that they are not as such a black box? And also, I would ask what has been the role of social movements and local communities also in this process of building up the EUDR and the policy-making process before it was approved?
Yes, thank you. So in terms of the producer countries, so from what I see, like overall there's broad discontent with the EUDR, but then from what I heard, but I didn't look into detail, is, for example, that Vietnam is rather supportive because they see some benefits, because apparently they have a good system for their coffee value chains. But there are these coalitions of, for instance, like-minded countries that issued these rather critical position papers. And what I personally find interesting is that they don't necessarily disagree with the overarching goal now of addressing global deforestation, but then how the EU went about it. So, for instance, a key criticism is this benchmarking system, which they perceive as discriminatory and unfair. And this criticism actually is also shared within some of the delegations within the European Commission. And in terms of social movements, so I followed a few webinars, and like there were also some NGO representatives, and like sometimes it got pretty heated between the EU officials and those. So they did follow, but I think it was also a select few that were aware about these developments, for instance, in Indonesia through the FLEGT VPAs. But otherwise, I think it took quite some time until they got aware about the emergence of this new EU law. Thank you.
We have time for maybe one more question.
Thanks very much. Can you say anything about the designated authorities that each member state has to sort of instruct to then implement the law?
Yeah, so from my latest update, which is not like the most recent ones, the member states were a bit late in announcing their competent authorities. So when I last checked, which was a few months ago, it was just 14. Even though like all of them should have announced. But yeah, they're also struggling a lot with this because there are now these minimum inspection obligations. They don't really know how many operators there are. So they also find it difficult to calculate how many checks they actually have to do. And then also now merging forest and agriculture commodities. So then they discuss like should the forest-related ministry or the agriculture-related ministry be the competent authority, or should there be maybe two competent authorities responsible for it? Yeah, thank you.
And with that, I'd like to invite Rafaela.
Yes, so Rafaela will present related work now zooming into the policy coherences and incoherences of the EUDR with some national policies and governance mechanisms.
Hello? Thank you, everyone, for being here. Can everyone hear me? Yes? So it's really a pleasure for me to share with you our work. And it's great because I believe Laila did a great introduction. So now it's kind of the second step of our work in the Clever project. And so what I'll be talking about today is our paper on EUDR hits the ground, interactions between transnational and domestic environmental regulations. And this is a paper based on great work with different co-authors from different organizations within this project. My name is Rafaela Ferraz-Ziegert, and I'm a researcher and PhD candidate at the University of Freiburg as well. So, problem and knowledge gap, as all of you know, land use needs to be regulated, and there's been an increase in regulation, be it because of through public policies or private governance mechanisms, certification, moratorium, zero deforestation commitments. There's been then attention to supply chain regulation, and that's because, of course, commodities have been coined as a big driver of deforestation. So there's also been attention to transnational trade. However, this then also highlights regional power dynamics, right? What before used to be the consumer-producer, north-south relationship that most people would talk about has increasingly become a south-south trade relationship. And there's been in the literature a call for a better understanding of this producer-side regulation, right? Not only just studying northern transnational standards. And so there's all of these different governance arrangements, but they do not act in isolation, right? They highly interact with one another. So then we come to this question: how do transnational environmental regulations actually interact with domestic regulations as they hit the ground? So basically when they then are implemented. So our research aim, the idea was then to use the EU regulation on deforestation-free products as a case study, exactly because it's quite novel in its regulatory design. And it was adopted in 2023. Great that Laila already did the introduction. And the idea is that it will be implemented from next year onwards. But let's see if there will be a delay of a year, right? But yeah, with EUDR, there's still this big question: how will it be effective on the ground? So then we believe that investigating this policy interaction, because of course in terms of consequences, usually we think about market leakage or smallholder exclusion, which, yesterday I think it was Charlotte was presenting, I don't know if she's here. But then we think that policy interaction could also inform us about implementation effectiveness, possibly in producer countries, and also best practice for regulatory design of next transnational environmental policies. As Laila said, there are now other countries, other consumer countries that are thinking of doing similar regulation. So with that in mind, we have these two research questions. How do these selected policies, and I'll introduce them in a second, interact with UDR and their design goals, instruments, and processes? And then what are also stakeholders' perceptions of that regulatory interaction? So our theoretical framework basically is in this broader framework of policy and governance coherence, which would mean when different regulations can achieve their goal without significant trade-offs. What we know is very difficult. But it's in that literature that we were looking into, try to understand these interactions. We basically combined two existing frameworks, and we focus on the regulatory design of these mechanisms. Design meaning in a regulation cycle, we looked at how these policies were designed to work, especially because the UDR isn't implemented yet, so we thought, this makes sense. So then we get to our adapted framework. The dimensions that we analyzed were the overarching goal of the mechanisms, specific goals, the requirements needed then to achieve that goal, and then what are the mechanisms needed to implement the policy. And then as we did the analysis of these different dimensions, we could get to what we call the character of interaction of the different policies. So either they coordinate, either they compete, be it for resources or membership, or they co-opt, so meaning maybe they have the same goal, but then the requirements, one will ask for something more or something different. And chaos. Chaotic would be when there's no point of comparison. And probably there are many of those around. Okay, so methodology is a qualitative research design. So also my background is on social and political sciences. And the analysis steps were First of all, identifying the mechanism. So our 3 case study countries, as Laila presented, are Brazil, Cameroon, and Gabon. And the criteria for selecting them, these policies are domestically relevant, they could be impacted by the UDR, and they are unique in their design with regards to the other ones. So we wanted to get different types of regulations to be able to analyze. This coherence analysis is vertical in the sense that we're looking to different geographic scales, horizontal, meaning that we're going into the agriculture and forestry sector, and we look into the design. Okay, the elements of interaction we talked about, and we include also perceptions of stakeholders. Our analysis is based on literature, a deep analysis of the policy documents per se, and we actually conducted 100 semi-structured qualitative interviews. So remember, this was a big research group, not only me, and we all with counterparts in these different countries, from October last year to March this year. So let's go to the results. Basically, we get to this table. And one finding, of course, is that there's no chaotic interaction, but that is already an expected finding because we selected the policies already thinking about what could be in relation to the UDR. The bigger table then comes to this, but I know this is difficult to read and I won't go through each of the boxes, but to be able to explain here in the 10 minutes what our results are, I'll do it like this. So basically, overarching goal. These policies do coordinate in their overarching goal in the sense that there is a general goal of protecting native vegetation and there is an idea of having sustainable standards. However, in their specific goal, there is a competition element specifically with forest laws. And here we looked at, of course, it's generalizing the forest laws in the 3 countries. Of course, there are differences between them. But there's already a big difference with regards to forest laws related to the full country in terms of scope, whilst the UDR is specific to 7 commodities and also what's based on their forest definition. And they also ask for 0 deforestation, right? The forest laws actually permits legal forestation. And there's a competition in terms of country interest. So as Laila mentioned, the flagged VPAs for Cameroon, that's actually a mechanism to be able to make it easier for Cameroon to sell timber into the EU, but actually the UDR is more of a restrictive regulation. Okay, so coming to the regulatory requirements, they compete in this terms of scope, and I know that Aline will really go into this in depth, but of course the forest definition is this big caveat in the UDR, meaning that it won't cover, for example, the Cerrado in Brazil, right? The cutoff date, and this can be something, for example, with the Amazon soy moratorium, which is a private hybrid mechanism in Brazil already for 20 years and has a cutoff date in 2008. What does it mean coming now a new regulation with a cutoff date for 2020? Giving lowered recognition, so this is the case for the flagged VPA. Exactly under the EU timber regulation, it was given a green lane, but now with the UDR, not really. Sorry. And co-optation, because there are existing requirements in these regulations, but the UDR asks for more. And not only asks for more, but when you see into the implementation and enforcement mechanisms, and this is the whole discussion, is that there are already systems in place. So it's not only that, they are more restrictive, it's not just that, it's just that also they are not necessarily accepting what already is in place in the country. So that's difficult because then you are replicating types of tools or strategies needed. However, in the implementation and enforcement mechanism, there is coordination in the sense that the idea of what to use, such as monitoring as a mapping and GIS and all this, is the same, is coordinated. However, as I just mentioned, there are superimposed enforcement mechanisms. Okay, take my time. Very quickly for the stakeholders' perceptions. So there is a general perception that national legislation is the biggest leverage to combat deforestation. However, everyone knows and says there are enforcement issues. And when I say national legislation, it's not just the forest law. It's the forest law together with the other types of regulations, for example, in Brazil with PPCD. However, the UDR could enhance effectiveness, right? So for example, in Brazil, helping with the analysis of the car. Okay, I'm gonna need to go quicker. With regards to certification and moratorium, we already know that the companies that either sign the moratorium or have certification, they have systems in place that can make it easier then to have compliant products to the EUDR, but since, as Laila mentioned, there's no green lane, certification bodies are working hard to adapt and maintain their relevance. But the EUDR could also learn and gain from these best practices and maybe consider what already exists on the ground. And these are just examples of these mechanisms, but there are many amazing tools used in these producing countries already. Okay, the Gabon mandatory FSC certification is an interesting case because it was seen as kind of a trend of countries wanting to have national certification schemes. So Argentina, for example, was given as another example with regards to soy. But then EU authorities would also say, but this is difficult because in a due diligence assessment, it's also then nationally specific. Flex VPAs, then everyone says, well, either it was a first step to the UDR or basically they lost its value. There are, of course, legitimacy questions, other conflictual interactions, but which Malini will probably say more, is this thing about the first definition versus zero conversion. But there are positive interactions. So we know that because of this whole discussion of the UDR, there is accelerated national traceability initiatives, and the UDR is seen as an experimentalist approach, right? So maybe there are kind of larger ripple effects that can happen with regard to the demand-side regulations. And last but not least, the Article 30 was really mentioned. Article 30 is on cooperation with producing countries. It was really mentioned as kind of a mitigation tool with regards to all of this incoherence. But of course, it all depends on how it will be implemented and political will. I'll go very quick. So the UDR basically is coherent with the national goals, but there's these incoherent cooptation and competitive characteristics, which may cause conflict and delegitimization. This can increase costs, governance challenges, issues with legitimacy. But a smart interaction with the UDR can be possible, right? When we think about policy mixes, you were talking about yesterday. I think that's the question for us to think about. So cooperation is definitely needed in this world of incoherence. Alignment is important, and basically we thought that our research could be important to add to the literature to consider the UDR's effectiveness in its overarching goal of reducing deforestation globally, and the implementation effects in the non-EU producer countries, and then insights for maybe new transnational regulation that will come into place. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Rafaela. We have time for just a few questions, maybe two from the audience. All right, I'll go in chronological order in the back, and then Britaldo.
Great. Yep, that's on. Great, thank you. This is a really interesting talk because you're getting into the implementation, which is the policy mix idea, to see what the existing initiatives are. And so I was curious, like your interaction types you had, compatible seemed to be like the best option there, it was coordination, which is like a compatibility thing. I wonder if you considered synergistic, so like the EUDR strengthening domestic strategies and vice versa. And then the other takeaway I had was that maybe the EUDR is just going to increase coverage and adoption of existing market-based strategies and other zero deforestation policies, or is it really going to require an entirely new system built up to provide that farm-level traceability? That we touched on that in our session a bit yesterday, but I'd like to hear if you have any other thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yeah. So, okay, I'll come to the first one afterwards because I think I forgot it. But the second one, and that's the big question, because actually this will depend on how the EU authorities, what they will receive, what they will accept for the due diligence statements. And the idea for now, from what we understand, is that it is in an EU system. So there's an EU system that all the operators and traders will have to include the due diligence statement. So for now, it's not really the idea to use what's happening nationally. So it's not, you are signatory of the soy moratorium, you kind of get a point plus, or you have a certification point plus. But that's something that I guess, and there's this whole discussion also of the UDR being delayed, can be maybe thought through in the implementation phase, because we also understand that for the EU authorities, I mean, it's 27 countries, it's also not easy for them, and that's also why there was a delay. So I think they're also trying to think, okay, what's the smartest way of doing this? But at the same time, of course, the moment you have a transnational, a global regulation, it depends on the commodities, you are dealing with so many countries. So we can understand, right, why they also didn't do a deep analysis of everything that happens nationally and okay, so let's do that. But maybe that's actually the smartest or most effective way to do if you really want to achieve the overarching goal. So that's also the difference between overarching and specific, because in the end, the UDR specific goal is actually more cleaning their supply chains, which fair enough. But then maybe they'll achieve that, but not the overarching of managing to reduce. And then the first question was on the synergistic. Yeah. No, but I think here and now it was more, I think, a picture of, okay, in their design, do they coordinate, not But I think that on what you're thinking, it would maybe be a next step of, okay, since they coordinate on this, how they can then help each other specifically. So I think I would see that maybe as a next step of then thinking how, so maybe more in the findings or discussion that would come in. So maybe the UDR could then help on this, such as analyzing the CAD, which is an issue in Brazil in terms of enforcing the first code, right? So that would be a next, yeah.
I'm so sorry. You can keep it very brief.
Okay, Rafaela, thank you. It was a great talk. I'm just curious about you mentioned competition between EDR and Brazilian legislation. Mm-hmm. What would be that?
No, it's in the sense specifically on how they are designed. So for example, the first code, the main, what we say is competition, is because the first code, it's for the whole country, and it does actually allow deforestation, which makes sense because in country interest, you also want to have the land used for something else. But the UDR is zero deforestation, right? So for example, that's an element of competition. So that's an example.
Okay, thank you.
So it's in their design of the regulation.
I'm so sorry. We're going to have to close questions here. And Aline, if you could come up. And we can continue the discussion over lunch and coffee.
Thank you.
Hello everyone, good morning. It's good to see the room packed and also to see familiar faces here. I'm Aline Soterroni. I'm a research fellow in the biology department at the University of Oxford, working on two initiatives, nature-based solutions and Oxford Net Zero. And today I'm going to share some results on the potential impacts of the UDR for Brazil Cerrado. It's an ongoing research, not finished, and I see potential co-authors in this room, so it's under development. But first, let me invite all of you to contemplate how beautiful Cerrado is. Cerrado is a biodiversity hotspot. Oops. Yeah, biodiversity hotspot with many endemic species. It provides, this rich biodiversity provides many ecosystem services, and Cerrado is also considered a water tank, especially when we think about the Amazon flying rivers. And these pictures, I decided to start my presentation with those pictures, also to remind ourselves why we are here, why we are researching, and why we are discussing ways to protect, restore, and sustainably manage ecosystems around the world, especially non-forest ecosystems like Cerrado that sometimes, many times, are considered sacrifice zones. So Cerrado is disappearing fast. Half is gone. Deforestation levels have been always high, even higher than in the Amazon, and I'm not talking about this period. Recently, last year, Amazon deforestation rate was smaller than in Cerrado. So we need to look for Cerrado, and Cerrado has been converted mainly for agricultural expansion, cattle ranching, biofuels, grains production, especially soybeans. Brazil is a global major producer and exporter of soy. Demand is increasing, and more than half of soybean area is located in Cerrado. Cerrado has low levels of protections. I'm talking about the forest code. While in the Amazon we have the soil moratorium, we don't have a similar agreement or mechanism for Cerrado. And what we have now, we have this momentum where a new wave of legislations are emerging that aims to govern the supply chains from the demand side. The most advanced one is the UDR, and for the Brazilian context, soy and cattle are the most important commodities because they are driving deforestation. But as we saw in previous presentations, many problems, and we still don't know in the future what would be the impact of this legislation if it is fully adopted. What we know is that the current UDR is not covering well Cerrado. So it's using the FIO forest definition that covers less than 30% of Cerrado, but there is a possibility of incorporating other wooded land in the 1-year review process when it happens. And then by incorporating other wooded land, it would improve Cerrado coverage. But again, and we know this is important for Cerrado. NGOs have been pointing to that, but we still don't know how much would be this potential implication of adding other wooded land. And as a modeler and a mathematician, sometimes we need numbers. Sometimes we don't need numbers, but sometimes numbers can help in a discussion. And in order to calculate those numbers, we are using scenarios modeling. And basically, I'm using Globiome Brazil model, which is a regional version of a global partial equilibrium land use model. I've been leading the developments and adaptation of this model for more than 10 years. I have no time to explain the model due to time constraints, but you can search for that. And this presentation, the scenarios of this presentation, is basically built upon these two studies, previous studies highlighted in yellow. And in scenarios modeling studies, we design scenarios. So we start with a baseline scenario where the deforestation levels or deforestation control is weak. We are assuming the soil moratorium will continue in the Amazon. It's an assumption. We could change that, right, Gustavo? But for the UDR, we are creating deforestation control scenarios. And just for the sake of simplicity, when I say deforestation, I mean native vegetation conversion. It's important for Cerrado. So then deforestation means that in my talk. So the UDR scenario is basically a zero deforestation scenario for beef and soy in areas classified as forest according to FIO definition. The UDR with other wooded land takes into account the other wooded land. And since we are talking about zero deforestation policies for Brazil, it's mandatory to have a forest code scenario. I don't have time to show validation results, but if you're interested, Globiome Brazil version is validated for the historical period, capturing the main trends in deforestation, production, emissions. You can find more information here in this publication. But let's look at the results. And let's start with the big picture. So according to the model and the baseline scenario, 64 million hectares could be converted in Brazil in the next 30 years, mainly for beef. Beef is mainly for domestic consumption. The EU exposure to this deforestation will be less than 1%. But for soy, it's the other way around. Soy is mainly for exports, and the EU would have a significant exposure to deforestation for soy in the future, a quarter, according to the model. I didn't say, sorry, but we overlap this future deforestation with traceability and transparency data from Trace. Okay, and this future deforestation for soy, as you can see in the map, is mainly going to happen in Cerrado and within Cerrado in Mato Piba, where the last undisturbed remnants of Cerrado are located. And another interesting result is that this future deforestation for soy, 2/3 are likely to be legal. It means that even if the forest code is fully enforced, it won't prevent most of the soy-driven deforestation in Cerrado in the future. So we need additional mechanisms. Is the UDR the one? Well, first things first, we need other wooded land. And consider this solid bar the EU exposure to soy-driven deforestation in the future. If the UDR is fully adopted, it will decrease deforestation a little. But if it considers other wooded land, it will improve this reduction in deforestation for soy. So the green bars there means the avoided soy-driven deforestation. And we can see that when the other wooded land is incorporated, the impact, potential positive impact, would almost sixfold. But we have to put those numbers into perspective. So then I add here the total deforestation for soy in Cerrado. EU exposure, around a quarter. The UDR as it is, in the best case scenario, I'm not talking about leakage here, in the best case scenario, 3% as it is. With other wooded land, it jumps to 16%. And this would require hundreds of companies to eliminate deforestation in the bilateral flow between Brazil and Cerrado. But what would happen if 6 companies, the ones, for example, in the Soft Commodities Forum, they adopt EUDR with other wooded land, but for all exports, not only the bilateral flow with the EU? The impact in reducing deforestation for soy in Cerrado would be more than a third. But comparing to the UDR, it would more than double the impact. Hundreds of companies here, 6 companies here. You might ask me, where is China? Well, China is important. It's important to consider China mainly for leakage aspects. And of course, if China follows a similar agreement, we would have a little bit less than half of future deforestation for soy prevented in Cerrado. But if China is going to follow this agreement or not, if it's going to be illegal deforestation, it's a topic for another presentation, much longer than this one. But what I would like to emphasize here is these 3 takeaways. So first, UDR needs to incorporate other wooded land. Second, the role of companies. We should focus on the role of companies. And third, UDR is not going to solve this problem. There is no silver bullet. But what I'm interested in and what we should discuss more is this positive chain reaction that the UDR can trigger, and especially when we think that it could move us from clean supply to clean suppliers. And last but not least, all models are wrong, but they are useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is this working? All right. Thank you very much, Aline, for the excellent presentation. We have a lot of questions. So Javier and then Maria. Okay, let's start here.
Thank you. This is a very interesting presentation. I would just want to know how the dynamics in the share of the exports to China change your model results. I mean, do you have a fixed share of those going to China, or do you fine-tune your model so that it goes more realistic to the dynamics that we might see in the future? But thank you.
Thank you for the question. I didn't have time to explain the model. David Leclerc is also here. He works with the model. I don't know if he's going to talk more about that, but it's a supply-demand model, and the future demand are driven by population growth, dietary chains, GDP. So we have an increased demand for soy from different regions, and the model simulates the competition for land, taking into account many layers, suitability, costs, and in the case of Brazil, we adapted the model to capture the country's specificities and reproduce what's happening in soy, for example, for the historical period. So the future demand for soy in the EU is basically flat, but for China, it is increasing in the future. But it also depends from where they are sourcing in the country. So then the trace data is super important to make to get some of those results. But many assumptions, many simplifications. But the point is, look at the best case scenarios and identify areas, promising areas, to advance the research further.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maria Brockhaus, University of Helsinki. Thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. My question is a bit maybe an impact question. To which extent are these results also informing current reanimated Mercosur discussions, the EU-Mercosur trade agreement? Is this also integrated in your model, the impacts of such a new revived trade agreement, which might have impact on demand, on competition? So do these results go there, and how do you incorporate that in your model?
I see a potential co-author here. No, I'm not considering this now, but I think it would have some implications, and it would be an interesting scenario to test. And this is the beauty of working with scenarios modeling, right? We create possible futures, and yeah, it's ongoing. But thank you for your comment.
All right, we're pressed for time. Sorry, we have a full session, but I'll do Sam and Claudia, is what I saw. And then we can continue.
It was a great presentation, thank you. So my question is, the EUDR is considering expanding to other wooded lands, but also to remaining non-forest ecosystems with the canopy cover less than 5%. Are you considering scenarios that include the EUDR impact on all ecosystems? And if not, I guess why?
Well, the total EU exposure is this scenario when we consider all native vegetation. So if we consider all native vegetation, and if it's fully adopted, best case, no leakage, the UDR would reduce 24% of future deforestation for soy. So yeah, the baseline scenario is somehow considering all native vegetation. But then UDR 3%, when you add other wooded land 16, maximum 24. So 3, 16, 24.
Thanks. So Claudia from Olam Food Ingredients. So we did an analysis also in Brazil. It's a place where we source no soybean, neither beef, coffee mostly. And I'm a bit surprised with the numbers because, you know, like the EUDR has this very sort of broad definition of forest with the 10% tree cover. So when we did that, actually, the Cerrado was very much covered in that area. So I was just wondering if you can clarify that. And then the second part is just a suggestion. So when you do the modeling, EUDR is very important, but could you also consider maybe in the future also the science-based target initiatives commitments of the companies, right? Because there you have the 2020 cutoff date as well as EUDR, but it's for your entire value chain. And it covers not only tropical forests, but also on all non-ecosystem conversions. So maybe that's also something you could model. Any serious company will have SBTIs issued. So maybe that also shapes the future.
Yeah, so try to answer very quickly. On the coverage, the FIO definition is covering less than 30%, right? I don't know if I got that, but we are considering that. So less than 30% coverage in Cerrado, jumping to 82 if other wooded land is adopted. We are somehow trying to capture that, especially for soy and beef, looking into soy and beef. On the company side, absolutely, we have we have hundreds of zero deforestation commitments, net zero now. Large companies, they have commitments to eliminate deforestation next year or net zero in a decade, but voluntary. So that's why the U is important, because it is a demand side. And sure, we have to focus on the companies. As I showed you, 6 companies for soy would have a higher impact than the UDR in the best case scenario implemented by hundreds of companies, 6 companies. For cattle would be similar, but I still don't have the data for domestic consumption for beef supplies. When I have this data, I can improve and do this analysis for beef as well. Thank you all.
Thank you, Aline. And with that, we welcome Priska.
Good morning, everyone. While the technical stuff is going ahead, I will introduce myself. So my name is Priska Kwaku. I'm a PhD student at the University of Cambridge. I'm also affiliated with the Conservation and Development Lab under the supervision of my wonderful supervisor, Professor Rachel Garrett. And today I'm going to present part of our work. So I will shift a little bit the conversation of today from the EUDR or forest conservation and protection policies to like forest restoration, which is mostly looking at agroforestry. I'm also shifting the conversation from Brazilian sector, like supply chain sector, to West Africa. So we will travel a little bit today. So my topic, presentation of today is titled Identifying Enablers for Just Sustainability Transition to Scale Up Agroforestry in the West African cocoa sectors. So this project has been, this work has been done with multiple co-authors, and some of them are in the room, like Joss. Thank you for being here. So the structure of the presentation will be, I will start by introducing the context of the research, then the case study, and I will follow by the methodology, and then present some of the findings and discuss them a little bit, but also I'm taking the opportunity of today to like discuss more with you because it will be helpful for my discussion section of my paper. So thank you. And then conclude with some takeaways, message and discussion. So the forest risk commodities productions like cattle and soy, and especially cocoa, is linked with deforestation, but also have some social impacts related to poverty, but also vulnerability to climate change. In the context of West Africa, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, the 2 leading producers of cocoa, covering 60% of the markets. But this one come at a cost of like deforestation. As you can see in the first picture, this is an illustration of like the Guinean tropical forest that has been cleared for monoculture production system, which is cocoa, as you can see in the second picture. This is leading to like multiple social and environmental issues, like especially climate change vulnerability of the farmers, fast aging of the cocoa farms, and then looking at all those issues, there's been an emergence of sustainability initiatives, and among them, the forest-focused supply chain policies, which cover forest restoration, and that's the one I'm much more focusing on. And this has been done in West Africa through multiple policies or certification system like Rainforest Alliance, but also private standard policy like Cocoa Life with Mondelez, and also sectoral agreement like the Cocoa and Forest initiatives. And under this initiative, there are 3 pillars, and one of the main pillars is like forest restoration, so agroforestry. So as you can see in the last picture, this is like the ideal world of like land restoration in the cocoa landscape. So there's been a lot of like initiatives like pushing for that. Yet the adoption of agroforestry is like very lagging. Why? The literature has identified some few potential barriers, but like this has been limited to specific level. So at the farm and household level, there has been identification of the complexity of the agroforestry system, which reduce farmers' adoption to that. There's been also at the national level one key point, that is the land and forest limitation codes toward the farmers. So the farmers don't have access to like the trees that are within the farm, which is like limiting the like interest of adoption of like agroforestry. Yet there's like a lack of systematic analysis at the multiple level, looking at the interaction between multiple level, like at the landscape level, international agreement, how they are putting pressure at the national level, looking at the forest codes, and as well as like the cocoa and agricultural policies, because these are two sectoral areas that are crossing. So we try to ask this question looking at those multiple levels, and we start by identifying using a descriptive analysis of like what conditions are foster first the emergence of agroforestry within supply chain policies, and then try to identify how that has been influencing local policies and like potentially alignment between the cocoa and forestry sectors to like support like the transition to agroforestry system. We had other questions, but for the sake of time today, I will just focus on these two main questions. So these are the case studies. I already defined that, so I won't really spend much more time there. But we are comparing Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, which are more or less similar in terms of like the supply chain, with like a highly concentration on the supply chain, with like much more power toward like the manufacturers defining or influencing the trajectory of like the policies. In Cote d'Ivoire, it's like a highly privatization system, so the manufacturers have much more power. But in Cote d'Ivoire, in Ghana, there's a slightly difference with like a much more presence of the government. So we are much more interested on how this structural difference as like influencing like this cocoa and forest sector alignment. So we did policy report analysis, a literature review to have a broader understanding of the situation. We coupled that with a semi-structured interview, roughly around 100, but as she was saying, it's a big group, so I wasn't alone doing those semi-structured interviews. And then we interview multiple actors within the supply chain to have like an in-depth understanding of like what are the different conditions and factors promoting or like pushing for like this cocoa and forest alignment. And then we did the analysis of those different data by using a specific framework, which is like the multi-level perspective framework designed by Gill, that is mostly used in energy sectors, but we apply it in the full sector system to understand what are the different level aspects that are interacting. And like, so we are much more looking at like horizontal aspects of like the interaction, but also vertical aspects of the interaction. So in terms of results, the first question, what conditions have fostered the emergence of agroforestry? So we look at key factors at the landscape level. So the landscape level can be exemplified by like global market pressure. It can also be exemplified by biophysical context like climate change, and how does it influence like on the ground. So we find key main landscape developments. I will just focus on like 3 of them. So the first is the climate change discourse that have pushed on like the narratives related to production system, which must be transitioned to a much more sustainable approach. So inclusion of like much more sustainable production system like agroforestry. And this has been also much more highlighted by provision of scientific evidence on like link between climate change and cocoa productivities that has been published by like one big report on the climate sustainability cocoa map. That like was a kind of like eye-opening for like different stakeholders within the supply chain, and this has pushed for like a much more pressing approach for transitioning toward agroforestry. And this has been exemplified during the interviews with stakeholders. Many stakeholders were like showing and highlighting farmers experiencing the effect of climate change within with their productivity. And then we look at the niche level. So all those landscape aspects, how they influence at the small scale level. So niche level are much more innovations and action to push toward transitioning for like a much more monoculture production system to a much more sustainable production system, which is agroforestry. So we try to classify or cluster those different niche initiatives by disruptive niche initiatives and incremental niche initiatives. So the disruptive niche initiatives, we define that as a radical change that is mostly provided and governed by like small scale and actors with outside the supply chain, like NGOs and civil society. And also we look at incremental change at kind of like small changes to push for like change or transition, but like which maintain the status quo, meaning that we are doing much more small things, but like it's much more like highly productive production system that we are pushing. So kind of greenwashing, I would say. So in terms of like the disruptive change, one key interesting element is that we find few companies doing some kind of agroforestry policies with clear targets about supplying or sourcing the cocoa for 100% of the cocoa sourcing to like agroforestry system. And also in terms of like incremental changes, what is like really clear and open everywhere is like those agroforestry engagement packages, meaning distributing millions of timber trees, mostly reducing to like 5 species and like very few like diversity within the farms. So looking at all of that, we look in Ivory Coast how this kind of different landscape pressure and niche innovation, how do they change like or influence like the regime? So meaning like in terms of aligning cocoa policies as well as forestry policies. And we find a small change, but one of like the most decisive and disruptive change is the adoption of a new forest codes that shift the land ownership situation to the farmers and says that who owns the land owns the tree, which is kind of very disruptive approach like to support or incentivize farmers to adopt trees. In Ghana, we find also lots of incremental changes, but they have a structural jurisdictional approach under the Ghana and Cocoa RED Plus program that provide a kind of much more structural jurisdictional approach supporting the landscape approach for like agroforestry adoption. So talking about that, in terms of conclusion, we find in general that there was like a lack of disruptive regime shift with a lack of disruptive niche innovation as well. And then in terms of agroforestry transition, we were like wondering, based on those plantation agroforestry system with limited diversity, are we not shifting toward much more what is called agri-biz forestry system, kind of like much more agroforestry landscape that is like less diversity. So what those results provide in terms of implications? So we discussed like about like are not this agroforestry transition should I not be much more providing much more safeguarding in terms of how we transition toward agroforestry, taking much more attention to like what we are being promoting. So, and then also we define that we need much more agroforestry policies, because so far we found only one company having a very strict agroforestry policy and very clear, with clear targets and comprehensive definition. Thank you.
Thank you, Prisa. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 quick questions. Yeah? 1, 2.
Can you talk a little bit more about the private innovation or partnership? Because in the state of Bahia, Brazil, the private sector is responsible for new varieties of cacao that, in my perspective, it's saving the Cabruca system there.
So if I understand well, your question is about like the role of private agents' innovations and how it's influencing the shift toward a much more sustainable production system. So in the context of West Africa, they have much more of the power in terms of like pushing for transition, but most of like the solution or the innovations they are providing is much more limiting to kind of transition to like an agroforestry system, but like which maintain or cover much more about like production instead of like diversity. So it's much more kind of incremental approach to like go towards landscape restoration, but it's like not very pushing for like sustainability or like in general diversity.
Hi, thank you so much, Prisca. That was great. I just wanted to clarify something. Did you say that the forest code had been changed in Côte d'Ivoire and that had had dramatic effects, or that was a recommendation that that would have a dramatic impact on in terms of ownership of trees on farms? Thanks.
So yeah, there's been a very radical change with these forest codes because historically, even though you own the lands, you don't own the tree. And most of the time, the government were giving permits or certificates for like logging companies to come and cut down the tree. So it was a disincentive for farmers to like keep trees within the farm. But now with the news, with this new regime shift, new policy shifts, it provides ownership to the farmers. So it's much more providing kind of dramatic change and in terms of adopting agroforestry in the future. Right now, it's not really effective because farmers are not aware about it, but it's like a need for like much more sensitization about this new forest code. Thank you.
Thank you for...
Preemptive applause. We'll just have, if you can keep it really quick, Minor.
Quick question, Prisca. You're not off the hook yet. Thanks for the good presentation. It's typical that regime incumbents co-opt alternative radical pathways, right? It happened to sustainable development, to regenerative agriculture. No surprise it happens to agroforestry. And they rob alternative actors of even the semantic means of conceiving of alternatives. My question to you is, what in your view could realistically demand side actors, given that cocoa is such an export-oriented crop, do to foster such radical changes that have been struggling to take place?
That's a very good question. And yeah, it's quite hard. I'm also asking myself while I'm writing this paper about what could push for much more disruptive change while taking into account like cocoa is like a so-driven capitalist production system. So actually I don't have an answer, but I want to discuss much more with you to find potential solution. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you again. Gustavo.
So hello everyone, good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Gustavo. Today I'm going to present a joint work with Jan Borner. Both of us are from the University of Bonn. I would like to apologize for the change in the title of my presentation because this is still a work in progress. And my talk today is going to be on the Amazon soy moratorium and its impact on deforestation in Brazil, as well as the role of international trade in this context. So the starting point of our study here is that most of the deforestation across the tropics is related to agricultural expansion. But more than that, because after the globalization, we also notice the creation of several new global supply chains across the globe. And of course, this also has some impact in this relationship. Why? Well, regions where products were being produced and regions where the products were being consumed, they become better connected, making this relationship way more complex. So now, not only local factors would explain how agriculture could drive deforestation. So given these 2 points, with our study here, we try to understand this very general question. How can we fight deforestation by the value chain? In order to explore this question, we use the Amazon soy moratorium as a case study. of course, this policy has been already studied a lot. We already have a lot of empirical evidence on it, and we also have some empirical evidence on the shortcomings, on the problem of leakage behind the Amazon soil moratorium as well. I think that most of you, to not say all, know what the Amazon soil moratorium is, but just in case, the Amazon soil moratorium is a voluntary agreement in Brazil in which soy traders signed an agreement in which they would not buy or finance soybeans produced in areas that were deforested in the Brazilian Amazon biome after a certain cutoff. The first cutoff date was the year of 2006, and then of course they also shifted to 2008 to better align with the forest code. And the Amazon soil moratorium also adopts a very complex monitoring system in which they use satellite imageries and as well like some kind of list of violators of the policy based on the buyers and the farmers. But there's something that is quite important to highlight here, that the Amazon soil moratorium follows a similar approach to the UDR in terms of not allowing any level of deforestation. So this is also a perspective related to like the deforestation-free approach. So here, I mentioned to you before, a lot of people have already studied this specific intervention. However, we still believe that two main points remain overlooked in the literature. And the two main points, they are related to international trade. In our case here, we want to show with our empirical analysis how international trade worked as a mediator and as a moderator of the impact of the Amazon soil moratorium in Brazil. In order to do that, we collected data from two main data sources, from Trace and from Map Biomas. Here we have a data set at the municipality and year level, and we collected land use and land cover change from Map Biomas for the period of 2000 to 2018, and we also collected subnational trade flows data from Trace from 2004 to 2018 in Brazil. This is the study region of our empirical analysis. This is the map of Brazil. Here you can see two groups of municipalities, the treated and the control groups, and you can also see a red line there in which indicates the biome border. And here, the treated municipalities are the ones located inside of the Amazon biome. So these were the municipalities affected by the Amazon moratorium directly. And the pink municipalities here, they are part of the control group because they are located outside of the biome. So they were not directly affected by the Amazon soil moratorium. And the other municipalities with this black line here, they were excluded by this, in the sample because they are crossed by the line of the border of the biome. And here we assumed a kind of like RDD approach to define who is part of the treatment, who is part of the control group, based on similar strategies already employed in the literature. And here we used a distance cutoff of 250 kilometers to define these municipalities and these groups. Here, as the main outcome variable in our case is the total deforestation of primary vegetation per municipality and year. And the treatment variable that we have is a very simple diff in diff. So it's just like an interaction between the treated municipalities and another dummy that identifies the post period of the Amazon soil moratorium, so post 2006. And here, that's what we try to emphasize as our contribution. Here we try to explore the role of the top 5, as well mentioned by Aline as well, the role of the private companies in these kind of policies. Here we try to understand how much of the impact of the Amazon soil moratorium was due to the top 5 largest soy traders in Brazil that we considered as the sticky traders. We want to better understand how much they contribute to the avoided deforestation from the policy. And here we also explore the role of some contextual factors related to international trade in terms of making the size of the intervention larger or smaller, the size of the impact of the intervention. And here we explore the different demand preferences from various international markets, how they change the size of the impact. We also explore the average level of stickiness, and we also explore the role of the local market concentration. So very quickly, this is a simple two-way fixed effects approach. Here we are mainly interested in beta 1. So we just compare the beta 1 in the two equations, because then we can get a sense of how much of the variance is captured by the insertion of the mediator, in this case, the top 5 soy traders. And this is the equation for the moderation part. So here is a simple triple differences approach. So here we just interact the double differences with some other variables that identify the heterogeneity of this specific policy. Yeah, sorry, I cannot go into the details of the methods, explain everything because of time. Okay, the results. So, as you can see in this table here, indeed, the top 5 largest soy traders were quite relevant to explain the total impact behind the policy. According to our analysis, these top 5 traders, they were responsible for about 24% of the total impact of the policy. And they helped the specific intervention to avoid about 540 square kilometers of deforestation in that period. On the moderation part, we also found support to say that these different demand preferences indeed matters for this context. So here we identify municipalities with different destination markets. So, for instance, one municipality shipping soy exports to the EU market, or soy shipping exports to China or to other countries as well, whether they experienced larger or smaller impact from the Amazon soy moratorium because of these dynamics. And we found here that the more environmentally friendly markets indeed helped to make the impact from the Amazon soy moratorium larger in these municipalities where they were like getting their soybeans as well. The same holds for stickiness. We also found that municipalities where the average stickiness level were higher, they also experienced a larger reduction of deforestation coming from the Amazon soy moratorium. And finally, the local market concentration. We also found that indeed some municipalities where the market was concentrated in the top 1, in the largest trader, they also experienced a larger impact. And here we used 2 different cutoffs to define whether the market was really concentrated or not. We identify municipalities where the top 1 largest trader had at least 25% of the market share, or at least 50% of the market share. And in these regions, indeed, the reduction of the deforestation were also larger compared to the other ones. Finally, just to conclude, so from our empirical analysis here, we only want to highlight 3 main points. The first one, it seems that indeed large and stickier traders, they might act as changing agents when we are talking about supply chain interventions. So these actors, they might be relevant to take into account for these kind of policies. The second point is that some contextual trade attributes might also be relevant to really try to make the impact larger or smaller, that is, work as a moderator. And finally, from a more like policymaker point of view, here we are analyzing the Amazon soy moratorium, something that happened in the past, but at the same time, we also believe that some, to not say almost all the results that we have highlighted here, they might also apply to the case of the new UDR because of the similarities of the policy. So just to conclude, we also want to highlight that when we are discussing the UDR, might be also relevant to take into account the role of international trade for this specific policy. That's it.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. We are running behind time, but we're in Mexico, so it's okay. Javier. And then Brita, then that's it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting presentation. I just have a question because you're talking a lot about the soy moratorium and also that you're doing a RDD kind of a method. So two questions is, first, how do you account that there are other policies that are just Amazon related? So like the credit restrictions, like the cattle agreements and so on. And the other one is when you apply or you do a RDD method, you're supposed to compare two individuals, municipalities that are very similar to each other except from the treatment effect. So did you do anything to check that you are actually having a good counterfactual?
Yeah, thank you for both questions. I think that they are very good. I have a bad memory, so I'm gonna forget the first one, but let's go to the second one. So, yeah, of course, here we are not using RDD, right? We are using like the rationale behind an RDD approach to define the two groups, but we also have the analysis like related to the before and after of the implementation of the policy. And I think that you raise a really good point, because, yeah, I think that one of the main assumptions behind the diff in diff would be the parallel trends. So whether the two groups, they are similar or they have similar trends in terms of the outcome variable before the intervention. And as you can see here, we try to plot the time varying treatment effects. And as you can see in the left part of the graph here, indeed, the both municipalities, they were similar, except for 2004 and 2005, because the deforestation during that period in the Amazon, it was like peaking a lot. It was increasing substantially as expected. But once you have the implementation of the policy after 2006, this deforestation level decreases substantially as well. I think that might respond to your question. And this is also another approach that we use. Before, we were only controlling for the municipality and year fixed effects. But here we also play a bit with some control variables. And I think that the main point that you raise might be solved by this specific control here. Because you were mentioned before that some other confoundings might also be affecting the treatment effect that we are highlighting here, right? So some policies related to rural credit and also like the TAC, the cattle agreements. So here we are including some controls related to soy area, pasture area, forest area, and state dummies. We are always interacting this control with year fixed effects, so they are constant in time at the beginning of the sample in 2004. But here, the last variable, the first row, we also include a group-specific linear trend. It's not a linear trend because I'm interacting with the year fixed effects, but it's the same logic. So here, I'm controlling for all the variance that is common for all the municipalities inside of the Amazon. So everything else that is happening for these specific municipalities are also being controlled here. But of course, you might also raise the same criticism that maybe I should exclude the municipalities where cattle agreements are being signed. There are different approaches to tackle this question, but I think that maybe we are handle that with this one here. Thanks.
Just tal vez ya nos pueden ir ayudando atrás para ir cambiando a la siguiente presentación.
Gustavo, thank you. Great talk. I just have a question. An issue with the soy moratorium is that it only focuses on the plot, right? So only the deforestation, only this where the soy is planted. But there is a lot of deforestation within the property, which is not accounted by the soy moratorium. So how did you measure deforestation associated with soy plantation?
Yeah, that's a great point. Here I didn't show, but yeah, I don't have the presentation anymore, but we also test like for the different land conversion. So rather than only looking at like the level of deforestation of primary forest, we also looked at the conversion from forest to soy crop. But it's also important to keep in mind that here our analysis is using a very low resolution. So it's at the municipal scale. So everything is on average. Of course, maybe we are missing some important aspects of the dynamics behind the policy. But yeah, that's the only way that we are handling this problem, including another outcome variable related to the conversion of forest to soy. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Gustavo. And David, if you can come up. And thank you to everyone who's still willing to be here. We will do our best to get you to lunch on time.
Good morning, everyone. I'm the last person between you and lunch. We'll try to not be too long. This is a work I'm presenting that span over 2 different projects and lots of people in Europe, in Brazil. So specifically the TradeUp project that was led by WCMC, and the Clever project that was already presented by several people in the room. I'm essentially going to try to zoom out from these case studies to the global scale and try to come back to the zoom in again in specific case studies. So when we zoom out and we try to think about overall societal pathways towards biodiversity goals, there are some examples out there now about exploring how we can get there at really global scale and what type of strategies we need. One thing which is not really clear in there is how will that affect trade, and what's the size of a prize if we regulate international supply chains adequately? What does it contribute to there? And once this will be dealt with, I will come back to the question of how we can compare more local case studies to that idealized pathways. So here the question that we were trying to tackle in the TradeUp project was really to understand a bit better the impacts of scenarios that are compatible with global goals for biodiversity on trade, and what's the contribution of, or the size of the price of getting trade regulation or supply chain regulations well. So we started again from the same type of scenarios that we explored in the Bending the Curve that looked at increased conservation, restoration interventions globally, and that in isolation or also combined with sustainable intensification on the supply side, or also with demand side measures, diet shift and reducing waste. And we added to that new scenarios specifically talking about the narratives for trade at global scale. So this was contrasting a baseline scenario where we would see higher levels of global integration in the markets and further liberalization. We had a kind of worst case scenario that would push that even further and faster than what we've seen before. And then we consolidated that with 2 scenarios where you would see probably more reduced or more regulated trade. One that was approaching that in a fairly uncoordinated manner, where you see a reduction, an increase in trade costs across continents, and you would see also unilateral measures, typically from the global north, to impose a ban or cap on the imports from tropical countries from deforestation commodities. And then this was contrasted with a greening of trade scenario that is seen as a coordinated idealized scenario where globally we would implement a border adjustment mechanisms based on biodiversity impacts. So something that looks like in economic and ecological terms a well-coordinated pathway globally. We put that in the same type of modeling pipeline that was used for the Bending the Curve paper, and that was also kind of presented by Aline as well, with a global version of the Globiome model, which is an economic model that translates the scenarios into outcomes in socioeconomic impacts. So for example, what are the changes in consumption, production, trade, value added, food security risks. And we also then translated the land use changes via biodiversity modeling tools into outcomes for biodiversity. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the details of the results, but just giving you a hint of the type of things we looked at. On the left-hand side, you have in the white bar the domestic demand, and in the blue bar the export demand for two commodities, soy and beef, from Latin America. On the top from 2010 in the baseline scenario, so matching historical trends, and then for all kinds of combinations of these different bending the curve and trade narrative scenarios. And so you can really look at what happens to the trade of specific commodities between regions and what's the share of domestic consumption versus export in the supply trends. And on the right hand side here you have, let me go back once. Here we look typically at to what extent we are able to decouple the consumption of agricultural commodities from their biodiversity impact. So in the y-axis here you would have how much we increase the extinction risks as compared to 2010, and how much here we increase the consumption. And the black line is the evolution over time in the baseline scenario where we see no decoupling whatsoever. And then you can play with the different colors about the bending the curve type of scenarios and with the different here symbols, different trajectories for the trade pathway. So that's taking 10 minutes to just go into that figure alone. So we'll not do that. I'm just going to come back to the key messages of this study. So when coming back to the question of what does bending the curve mean for trade, I think it's important to note that there is some margin for sustainable trade, but this is a lot less than in the baseline scenario by 2050. So there's going to be lots of shifts in the trade networks, but it's also noteworthy to point out that what is most disruptive in that picture, and that's also the case for how much we can decouple consumption from the biodiversity impacts, is changes in consumption and demand side. So that really makes the case that how we think about trade should deeply be connected to how we think about consumption. And when we look at what are the impacts of alternative trade futures, it's quite clear that trade liberalization will not help. There is also some emerging signal that uncoordinated trade restrictions might also not be great for food security, in particular for supplying increasing demand to Africa and Asia. Uncoordinated supply will not always be great. There is also these promising outcomes that are coming out of the idealized coordinated trade greening. And the last point to mention is that there is a lot of interactions, and in particular, again, if you consider a future where we don't question too much our consumption choices, then how you regulate trade will make a lot bigger impact than if we collectively agree to make our consumption choices more compliant with global sustainability goals. And that's fairly unsurprising, right? The more you put pressure on land, the more how you regulate trade matters overall. So now I'm going to give you a hint about how we come back from this global picture back to the specific case of how we can design intervention portfolios that are actually trying to go in that idealized place of coordinated trade greening, but with a bit more realism about what types of policies can be helping us to go there. So what we are trying to do now in the Clever project is to adjust and create new scenarios for soy supply chains and the links between EU and Brazil and the main other exporters, destination place for Brazil exports. So we'll keep this idea of looking at very stylized scenarios around the absorption space and really bring in these global consumption trends assumptions, and also play with also kind of a bit crazy benchmarks in terms of policies, whether we totally stop or forbid any conversion of natural land in Brazil. But then we will also start to look into modeling specific policy interventions, so that, for example, playing with the soy moratorium and how we could expand it, or in the Cerrado, for example, or potentially get away from that. Domestic policies like the Forest Code, and also international regulations like the EU-Mercosur and unilateral agreements or instruments like the EUDR. And now we are trying to get into slowly the phase of designing these scenarios with stakeholders. We are also trying to improve the modeling chain in the background. So one of the things we wanted to really get better at is better understanding the dynamics of the vegetable oil markets, because that's a key factor for the supply chains in general in the future. And that means better representing the different stages in the processing chains, better calibrating the trades of different byproducts associated with this supply chain, and also better understanding substitutions between vegetable oils and substitutions between livestock feed rations that could be associated with the co-products. And we also build a lot on the amazing work from Aline and INPE on better representing the land use dynamics in Brazil and the dynamics of the soy production systems. And we're also bringing to that new developments in terms of biophysical modeling to better represent the yields and the environmental benefits of different types of production systems for soy single versus soy corn type of production systems in terms of soil organic carbon or yields. And also not in the least, we are working with University of Valencia and University of Minas Gerais to get better biodiversity modeling associated to the supply chains. And then we are also trying to connect to the type of work that Gustavo is doing and others. So we are also trying to estimate better using econometric methods what could be the impact of the EUDR on the trade costs between EU and Brazil, but also between Brazil and other exporting partners. That comes with some challenges, and if we have time for questions, I can dig a bit more into that. We are also trying to kind of really improve the way we can uptake these econometric estimates in the global model, so relying on sensitivity analysis to understand what are the parameters that can best represent the estimated impacts from these types of regulation. So, key takeaways. It's quite clear that reaching ambitious biodiversity targets could be destructive to trade. There's going to be, in some cases, more trade and different trade than today, but a lot less than we would expect if we were not trying to reach the sustainability goals. And I think that's an important message to get. The role of demand side measures is quite key, and we need to think about the whole value chains. There is a hope that maybe if we get everything lined up perfectly in terms of international supply chain regulations, we could actually contribute quite a lot to global biodiversity goals. That's, again, depends on how we think about consumption as well. And that requires a lot of coordination across regions, across sectors, and across sustainability objectives. So that's placing a very high demand on the types of regulations we imagine for supply chains. Thank you very much for your time.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to everyone that stayed. If anyone has one urgent question for David, we're happy to take it. If we're all really hungry, we also understand we can talk about it over lunch. Thank you again. Very happy that you were here for our session.